Patrick Otema is 15 years old. He was born deaf, but in this remote region of northern Uganda, there are no schools for deaf children. In his whole life, Patrick's never had a conversation.
Hello. You good?
His father, Charles, looks after him. They are only able to communicate through very basic gestures.
We've been sitting here talking about Patrick in front of him, and while he's been watching us, he doesn't understand what we're saying. It feels almost rude. But this is what Patrick's life is like all the time.
I'm here with someone who wants to change all that. Raymond Okello is deaf himself and a sign language teacher.
Do you think he could learn sign language? This is pretty much Patrick's existence. His father gestures to him what he wants him to do, and when he's finished, he goes back to his hut to spend the rest of the day on his own.
Patrick's fate is not unusual. The majority of deaf people in sub-Saharan Africa have never been taught sign language. Unable to communicate with others, they are trapped in their own minds. Raymond became deaf as a child after a bout of malaria. 6 months ago, he travelled to the capital for intensive training in sign language. Now he's returned to his village to do something unprecedented. He's going to teach the first sign language course ever set up here.
Raymond, are you nervous?
It's 2 o'clock. The first deaf students start turning up. And class begins.
The course has already started, but Patrick hasn't turned up yet, and I'm worried that his father couldn't convince him to leave home.
A few minutes later, Patrick arrives.
Patrick's transformation is amazing. It's almost impossible to believe it's the same boy we met yesterday.
New deaf students keep arriving. Many have walked miles to be here. There's a 9-year-old boy and an 80-year-old woman. Before the end of the class, each new student goes to the front. The class votes on a new name for them. This is now Patrick's sign name, and he will use it for the rest of his life. He has just been baptized into a whole new world.
I've seen that clip 1,000 times, and it still gets me every single time. I wish Patrick Otema could be here with me now to meet you all, but I do know that he's doing very well. He's continued with his sign language classes, and he now says that he wants to be a sign language teacher himself. When I started out on this Ugandan adventure, I have to admit I didn't really understand why we were doing it. Find deaf people who have never been able to communicate and film their transformational moments. This is what our commissioning editor wanted, and I have to admit, it didn't make much sense to me. Everybody knows that being poor and marginalized in a country like Uganda is going to be pretty awful. And I didn't think it required a great leap of imagination to understand that being poor, marginalized, and deaf was going to be even more abysmal. Also, I was confused because where I work, we are just not in the business of making those old-fashioned, terrible, blinkered African horror films. I could not have been more wrong. We did not make an African horror film. I am proud that I was part of a team that made an uplifting film about deaf Ugandans making life better for other deaf people, because that is what we found. We filmed what we saw, and what we saw was Ugandans fighting and winning a battle, little by little, bit by bit, to make their country a better place. And the fact that there wasn't a Western NGO lurking in the background, staffed by wonderful, well-meaning, white 22-year-old university graduates, only helped reinforce my strongly held beliefs on the matter. In fact, the longer I spent in Uganda, the more I realized that my initial worries about this film were entirely to do with my own preconceptions about what it means to be deaf. The more deaf activists I spoke to, and the more deaf parents I was interviewing, the more it dawned on me that these people I was meeting, they weren't disabled. Deaf people are not disabled. They cannot hear, which makes it nigh on impossible to learn to talk, but this on its own should not be a disability. And it seems so obvious to me now that I almost struggle to admit it, but it's true. People who are born deaf or who lose their hearing, they have a linguistic hurdle, albeit a very serious and difficult one, but it's one that just requires a different approach, a different language. And that language is already out there. It's sign language, devastatingly simple and yet out of reach for so many people in sub-Saharan Africa. We've all seen the incredibly emotional YouTube clips of people who've been fitted with a cochlear implant, hearing their loved ones' voices for the first time. Technology like this has been incredibly useful to so many people, but the crippling cost of this kind of technology in the United Kingdom, a cochlear implant costs about 70,000 euros. That means that this kind of technology is out of reach for the vast majority of deaf people around the world. Patrick Otema himself, he was given a hearing aid at some point in his childhood by a well-meaning charity. But his father told me that the hearing aid required a rechargeable battery. And in case it wasn't clear, Patrick lives in a very isolated hut with no electricity. So the hearing aid did not last very long. And then once again, my point about well-meaning but utterly useless aid starts to raise its inconvenient hand again. 80% of people who are deaf in developing countries never get an education of any sort. And I'm not talking here about deaf schools which are specifically catering to their needs. So that means that in the world's poorest countries, only between 1% and 2% of deaf people ever learn sign language. That means there are hundreds of thousands of people like Patrick who live trapped in their own worlds because they don't know their own language, sign language. When I met teenagers like Jacqueline Mukamunga, who you can see in the photograph behind me, she's a student at a deaf boarding school, I asked her what her life was like before she knew how to sign. And she would say to me very clearly, I was sad before, now I am happy. Now I feel free. But neither Jacqueline or any of her friends could really go into detail of what their childhood without sign language was like. And for me, just as an outsider who was there asking the questions, it seemed like Jacqueline and her friends could only describe that other, that childhood with no means of expressing itself, as the exact opposite to what she lives now, which is freedom. Now I am free. But that's not to mean that just because you can sign fluently, your problems are over. Somebody like Jacqueline, she was 16 and preparing to take the exams which would allow her to finish primary school. Or there's Richard also, who we saw in the clip, who was teaching Patrick's class. Outside of the deaf community, very few people know sign language, which means going to a shop, visiting a doctor, or making use of a law court, virtually impossible. Richard told me how he was repeatedly given the wrong medication for malaria because he couldn't describe his symptoms. And Jacqueline, and this was a sentiment shared by every single deaf woman I met, said that she lived in fear of being raped. Rapists believe that someone who is deaf will not be able to report them to the authorities. Tragically, they are often right. But this isn't just the situation for people in poor countries like Uganda. Being deaf in Europe also means you face abuse, stigma, and an increasingly difficult time accessing services, which are only being cut. After our documentary was released, a lot of people from the United States got in touch with me to say they knew deaf people in their own communities who, without education, technology, or a means to communicate, lived utterly isolated. There are many people like Patrick all over the world. The difference being in the southern hemisphere, there are proportionally many more deaf people because of congenital diseases like measles, mumps, rubella, and malaria. So it was being in Uganda, surrounded by these incredibly talented and dedicated, hard-working deaf activists, students, and teachers, that I started to realize just how important our ability to communicate is to who we are. And what we see when we watch Patrick in that class is a young man being given an opportunity he so needs and deserves to be himself, to have a voice, even if it is a voice that we see rather than the one that we hear. And what was so extraordinary about filming in that classroom was just how immediate the effect was on Patrick. And I'm so glad that that is also clear in the final edited version. Patrick's father told us that he had never met another deaf person before. And yet here he is in a classroom surrounded by people like him who are communicating in a language that he knows is his because it uses movement, expression, and hands. It's sign language. And the devastating, touching, incredible simplicity of that moment is impossible to make it up. My extremely talented director who I was with in Uganda, Daniel Bagado, who has traveled all over the world and is as hardened and toughened a producer and director as is possible to come across, he had tears welling up in his eyes behind the camera. He had to take a little bit of a moment out to just emote. We knew we were witnessing the impossible. A young man leaving behind 15 years of living in a prison of isolation forever. As filmmakers, we also knew we had something special because journalists like me spend far too much time reinterpreting and arguing over the people with the loudest voices, the people who find it easiest to shout. Rarely do we get the chance to tell stories with people who just aren't asked, the quiet ones. And the fact that now millions of people around the world have watched and shared that moment with Patrick, well, that just makes me feel good about us, all of us. It's not all cats falling off pianos and babies dancing the samba. But I also have to admit that a lot of these interviews were incredibly frustrating and difficult for me. It's hard enough working with an interpreter who has to translate both question and answer. But what would happen here is that often I'd find myself kind of ducking out of the way so that the interviewee and the interpreter can communicate over my head. And in all of my sort of crazy ducking and diving and the director going nuts with me, I realized that what we were actually capturing on film were these incredible, expressive silences. So much going on, nothing for a hearing person like me to hear. And as a reporter, silence is usually not a good thing. I mean, you don't really want too much silence unless the person you're interviewing is about to cry. And there's only so many long, meaningful glances that your editor is going to put up with when you're back in the cutting room. But what we had here was silences that were full of stories and emotions and just an outpouring of emotion. We filmed in the canteen of a deaf school, and it was hundreds of kids, hands flying everywhere, smiles and expressions and storytelling. But none of it was for me. There was nothing me as a hearing person could actually listen to. And then I thought again about Jacqueline and what her friends would say. Now that they were fluent in sign language, she would say, "Now I feel free." Jacqueline and her friends, who know sign language, have been freed from the prison of not being able to communicate, but their voices are still largely unheard. They're silent. And they're silenced by people like me who do not listen. So that's what I take away from my 3 weeks in Uganda and my months immersed in this story, I want to listen to the quiet voices all around us. I want to listen to the silenced voices and find them. The power and wisdom of unheard voices is everywhere. If only we stop to listen. The ability to communicate lies at the very heart of who we are. It's essential to our very being. Deny someone the ability, their right, to be heard, and you take away an essential core of their humanity and ours. I would like to finish by celebrating a little bit the language in which I was immersed during my time in Uganda. And so for that, I'd like to speak in a little bit of Ugandan Sign Language. And I would just like to say, and to my friends in Uganda, thank you for teaching me to listen to silenced voices. Thank you. Thank you all.